Hey, I'm Super. Welcome back to the Monkey Farm. So there are some formative experiences you have as a child that just stick with you forever. For example, I went with my family to see Raiders of the Lost Ark when I was 5. It was one of the first memories of a theater experience that I have, along with the previous year's The Empire Strikes Back. So the image in my head of the power of God melting a Nazi's face like it's a candle is burned into my brain forever. And that's not a bad thing because that scene is awesome and still holds up. But I'm not here to talk about melting Nazi faces. I'm here to discuss something bigger, quite literally. In specific, giant robots who turn into other things for some reason. They're more than meets the eye. Robots in disguise. The moon that hits your eye like a big pizza pie. I think this got away from me. Yeah. Anyway, this is a brief history of the Transformers and the movie that scarred all of us as children for life in 1986. I hope you're all going to be happy when I get this right, because I've had to say this line like 5 times to not mess it up. Transformers began as 2 separate toy lines in Japan by a company called Takara. The first was called Diaclone, which was a line of robots that through a series of steps could be turned into vehicles like cars and airplanes and back into robots. The second was a line called Microchange, which was itself an offshoot of a popular line in Japan called Microman. And you can make your own adult jokes here. I know you want to, so just get out of your system. I'll wait. So Microchange was like Diaclone, but instead of vehicles, the robots turned into everyday household items, like cassette tapes, guns, boom boxes, normal stuff that we have in our houses today just sitting around. They were both relatively new toy brands, but popular when Hasbro, the Disney of the toy world who buys everything eventually, licensed both of these lines from Takara to sell in the United States in 1984. They merged the 2 lines and set about trying to replicate what had been a successful formula for their G.I. Joe, a Real American Hero toy line 2 years before. They created a new mythology and backstory because, by and large, none existed in the Japanese toy lines. They were just cool toy robots that turned into stuff. And that's not to crap on the Takara line, because those are pretty ingenious in design. Robots are pretty much always cool, but there wasn't a lot in the way of good robot toys at the time, and if there were, they were just robots. The end. Diaclone and Microchange gave them this extra added play value of giving you essentially 2 toys in one. Because who doesn't like robots, but also who doesn't like having like cool cars and jets and stuff that you can play with too, and occasionally guns for some reason. And then they had an extra added play value of the puzzle aspect of figuring out what steps to do to turn each one from one form into another. And some of those were pretty simple, and some of them were a lot more complicated, but it was just cool. And some of us who were way too inquisitive as children, like myself, found an extra play mode in using a screwdriver to take them apart and see how they worked on the inside. Or maybe that was just me, but I know there are others out there like me. I know you're out there. After Transformers was a hit in America, Takara went all in on that and ended both the Diaclone and Microchange lines and rebranded it all as Transformers in Japan as well. So in the process of trying to create this new mythology to use for the toy line, Hasbro worked with comic book writers Jim Shooter and Dennis O'Neil to create a backstory, and then put out a comic series to tie into the toys. Another writer and artist, Bob Budiansky, created most of the names and characters during his run on the comic, which was put out by Marvel initially, and was technically considered part of the Marvel Universe at the time. They even had a cameo of Spider-Man in issue 3 of the comic. At the same time, Marvel worked with Sunbow Productions to create a cartoon to promote the toy line, with both the toy line and the cartoon using the names created by Budiansky, but not necessarily the same story. So the comic canon and the cartoon canon are totally different. And with toys, what even is canon? I used to go play with my Transformers toys and G.I. Joe and Masters of the Universe and Star Wars and whatever random crap that I had, and it was all canon to me. If I wanted Starscream to have a battle in the skies with the Millennium Falcon being piloted by Snake Eyes, I could do that, and it was awesome, and you can't take that away from me. My initial introduction to this entire franchise, by the way, was oddly enough, episode 3 of the animated series, which was part 3 of a 3-episode origin story. So I was thoroughly confused. I had no idea who was who, but I was intrigued. It was really cool. But I was also, 8. So I started getting whatever toys I could. We were not really well off when I was growing up, but I occasionally would save enough to buy one of the bigger toys. The holy grail for me was the Megatron, which I never did get my hands on until a few years later when I traded some stuff I didn't want for a broken Megatron toy with no legs and no accessories. So you could transform him into a gun mode, but there was no pistol grip and I didn't have the cool scope or anything else. So I don't know why I did that trade, but I was 10, so I wanted one really badly, I guess. Honestly, the robot mode on Megatron is kind of terrible, so why would you want that for anything but the gun mode with that toy? Because the gun mode looked pretty cool. It looked like a real gun. That probably led to some issues that I was not even aware of or were not on my radar when I was 10. Either way, the basic canon of the comic and the cartoon was that these robots from the planet Cybertron had crash landed on Earth during a planet-wide war, but they crashed in prehistoric times here and ended up buried underground until 1985 when they emerged and continued their war between the heroic Autobots and evil Decepticons. There's more to it, but I don't want to go too far into the minutia of the different canon stories and how they diverged, so I'm just going to move on to the movie. So the toy line had been released in '84, and by '86, some of the toys were having a real lull in sales. Everyone had already bought them. Nobody needed to buy 3 Megatrons when most of us only had 2 hands. And since toy sales were the only reason Hasbro was doing any of the other stuff in the first place, they wanted to make a theatrical film to tie in the toy line and introduce some new toys. I mean, beloved characters. That probably would have been enough, and probably worked out pretty well. But they also decided, in conjunction with new characters, they needed to kill off the old characters. So this resulted in the first half hour or so of Transformers the movie being more or less a relentless massacre of half of your favorite characters and favorite toys, culminating in the death of everyone's robot dad, Optimus Prime. The movie overall is summarized like this, and I apologize for the length and the fact that even then I am leaving out stuff because they didn't affect much of the larger plot, and because so much happens in this and there are so many characters, some stuff's just going to get skipped. So there's this giant planet called Unicron that eats other planets and everything that lives on them as violently as possible. That's how this movie starts. Robot massacre. Planet-wide destruction for 10-year-olds. Meanwhile, totally unaware of this, the Autobots have a base on the moon of Cybertron. Well, one of the 2 moons of Cybertron, whatever. And an entire city of their own with the very creative name of Autobot City on Earth. While the Decepticons have taken over Cybertron as a whole and are now in total control of it, it's the far distant future of the year 2005. The Autobots plan to attack Cybertron and depose Megatron, but the Decepticons find out. The Decepticons plan out a secret preemptive ambush of the city, starting with a takeover of a shuttle full of Autobots that they hijack, during which they graphically murder several of them while a metal song called Instruments of Destruction plays over the carnage. Again, this is like the first 10 minutes of this movie. Nothing but death. Eventually, this leads to a scene where Optimus Prime goes to find and take down Megatron, no matter the cost. That's a terrible impression of Optimus Prime. I'm so sorry. During this, he runs over or shoots a ton of Decepticons, but this is done while the soundtrack plays an inspirational song, so it plays a lot differently from Megatron shooting Ironhide in the face. But if you think about it too hard, it's like if Rocky III had a montage scene where Rocky just runs around Philadelphia punching people in the face while Eye of the Tiger plays in the background. Though to be honest, Peter Cullen's Optimus Prime voice is so commanding and authoritative, you just want to follow his lead. He is just like this natural leader tone. He could approach me in the street and ask for my wallet, insisting that it's for the good of the planet, and if he used that voice, I'd probably just hand it over. Moving on, Optimus and Megatron mortally wound each other, partially due to the inept intervention of new toy Hot Rod. This is all to set up Hot Rod's guilt and ultimate redemption later, and also to set up yet another toy. At this point, for the first time in the animated series, it's revealed that Optimus carries within him an object called the Matrix of Leadership. And this had been mentioned at some form in the comic books called the Creation Matrix there. And its entire purpose was that Hasbro mandated that they wanted a way to explain where new robots came from, and wanted to make there be no question that robots did not produce sexually. They intended for all robots to be genderless, so this plot device of a creation matrix was made as a thing that exists within Optimus Prime that he can use to create new robots. But there's no robot sex. Except Jazz. Jazz definitely fucked. Sex robot, sex robot. It's also interesting that the first time this plot device, which was created to explain why robots have no gender, comes up in animated canon, they've already introduced in this very film one of the first female Transformers, and the most well-known, RC. I have no complaints about RC. I wish they'd given her something more to do in the movie as a new character other than exist. But again, this is just a big toy commercial. They didn't make an RC toy from the movie, though. One was planned, but it never went past the design stage. There wouldn't be a toy for her until another 15 years later in 2001. And even then, the toys that were out were repaints of previous toys, not really true to the movie model. It wasn't until 2014 that a Film Faithful RC toy was released. They planned to put her in the 2007 Michael Bay film, but couldn't figure out how to explain a female robot existing. She eventually appeared in the live-action sequel, Revenge of the Fallen, but as a motorcycle, and then dies unceremoniously because they still don't know what to do with a female robot. But I digress. As a kid watching the '86 movie, having not read the comics at the time, The Matrix was new info, and honestly more than a little confusing, but I kind of just rolled with it, because I was 10 and it was just like, oh, well, this is a thing, okay. I just accepted it at face value. They treat this as a given that everyone knows about and is super important, but the movie is following more cartoon canon in which this has never previously been a thing. So it is a little confusing if you think about it, but as a kid, didn't matter. Anyway, Optimus decides to give this item to the new toy, Ultra Magnus, and passes on leadership to him before he dies. And yeah, I'm going to make the joke about new toys instead of new characters a few times here. I'm sorry, but I am also not sorry. As he's attempting to do this, he drops the Matrix, and it's saved from falling to the floor by Hot Rod. And I'm right now realizing for the first time that it may be that him touching it before giving it to Ultra Magnus is why the Matrix later definitely imprints on Hot Rod. Never occurred to me before, right now. Is the line of succession through the Matrix touch-based? Is that why when you've got the touch, you've got the power? Yeah, think so. So Optimus dies, and for some reason changes color to gray tones when he dies, which doesn't happen to any other robots in the movie, but it is a dramatic moment. It definitely made children cry, and it was creepy as anything and very effective. So while this is going on, the Decepticons have grabbed their wounded and headed back home to Cybertron. But they are running out of fuel, so to save fuel, they decide the best thing to do is dump some dead weight, the wounded. So they leave Megatron and several other Decepticons for dead. Unicron finds them and offers a deal where he'll revive them and give them new bodies. But they have to agree to serve and obey him. So they agree to this. Megatron becomes a new toy called Galvatron and promptly goes and kills Starscream while Unicron eats both of Cybertron's moms. My notes says moms. It's moons. Cybertron doesn't have a mom, much less two. It has two moons. So Unicron then orders Galvatron to go and find the Matrix, which is conveniently the only MacGuffin that can destroy him. Eventually, Galvatron goes back to Earth, attacks Autobot City. The Autobots evacuate, but they get shot down in space on a few different planets. There's some stuff with Dinobots because Grimlock is the best. He doesn't get to do much in this movie but comic relief, unfortunately. But still, I love Grimlock. He is my son, and I will not hear a word against him. Eventually, Galvatron ends up nearly killing Ultra Magnus, ripping parts off of him. Initially, there was supposed to be a scene that was storyboarded where they essentially all tie Ultra Magnus's limbs to chains and rip him apart, basically. They decided that was too far, so they didn't do that, but they do nearly kill him. So he then steals the Matrix, thinks he can use it to control Unicron, which he can't, because he can't get the Matrix to open. And if you can't get it to open, its power is useless. So, also Unicron reveals that he's actually a really, 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 really big robot himself, which is not much of a surprise, and starts actively destroying Cybertron in retribution for Galvatron's disobedience. A giant battle ensues between the Autobots, the Decepticons, and Unicron. Hot Rod fights Galvatron inside Unicron's head and ends up, almost by accident, opening the Matrix just slightly, just the tip, which instantly causes him to become a bigger, more powerful robot, Rodimus Prime, which, let's all be completely honest, is not a great name. But whatever, it's a second toy to buy, which I bought because I was 10. Also, if Ultra Magnus had been able to open the Matrix, would he have gotten an upgrade and now have a new name too? Would it be Ultra Prime, Prime Magnus, Ultra Primus?
That is extremely kind of you.
Rodimus Prime then beats Galvatron and then opens the Matrix the rest of the way, while the same inspirational 80s music from earlier plays, which causes Unicron to spontaneously explode into space, into pieces. We can only conclude from this that Unicron is allergic to inspirational 80s power ballads. And we all left the theater feeling slightly traumatized, but I kept buying toys, so in that sense I guess it worked. One way the movie definitely didn't work was in terms of box office receipts. Part of the problem was bad word of mouth after they murdered Robot Dad on screen 30 minutes into a 90-minute movie. But we also can't discount how many other movies out that weekend were just bigger draws. It was a big week and a big summer for movies. The number one movie that weekend was Aliens, and it was in its 4th week of release. And let's all be honest, given the choice between watching Transformers and watching Aliens, we're all watching Aliens because that movie is nearly perfect. But it's not even like, oh, Transformers didn't get the top spot, but at least it was in the top 5 now. It didn't even break the top 10 that weekend. It was up against Aliens, as well as franchise entries from Friday the 13th and Karate Kid, as well as Top Gun and Howard the Duck. Howard the Duck was in the top 10 that weekend. This wasn't. Let that sink in. It also got dismal reviews from critics. Here's an example from Scott Kane, a staff writer in Atlanta. I am offended that the Transformers is a 90-minute toy commercial. Even worse, it paints a future in which war is incessant. Well, that didn't age well. Also, then I went to look at other reviews of this guy. He gave a negative review to the vampire classic Near Dark, but a positive to the third Psycho movie. So I think this guy just doesn't know what the hell he's talking about, in general, maybe. But also, let's just ponder this offense that he takes at a 90-minute toy commercial, based on a long series of 30-minute toy commercials, based on a toy line. Were you actually surprised, my dude? Did you think this was going to be some Akira Kurosawa level art? Because that's on you, buddy. I knew it was a big toy commercial and I was 10 years old. What's your excuse? Back to the topic of the death of Optimus Prime, it's interesting because several people making the movie tried to tell Hasbro this is a mistake, including the film's screenwriter, Ron Friedman. He told them that they'd eventually have to bring Optimus back because this was simply not going to work. They responded insistently that they needed him to die, they weren't ever bringing him back because they had great things planned. By which, of course, they meant new toys to sell. A story consultant has said after the fact, we didn't know he was an icon. It was a toy show. We just thought we were killing off the old product line to replace it with new products. By February the following year, they'd reversed course and released a 2-part episode for the animated series entitled The Return of Optimus Prime, just to make sure it was front and center that Dad was back. In a bit of irony, if I'm using irony right, and I'm probably not because I was a teenager for part of the 90s. It's like this two-parter was also where they upgraded long-standing classic character Bumblebee to Goldbug, due to a plot contrivance in which he needed to be coated in a gold-colored metal to be immune to a spreading hate plague that affected humans and robots and basically any sentient living thing. It's interesting because it demonstrates that they did figure out a way to bring in a new toy without killing an old character, but I think they had to go through the experience of the movie to realize that. Also, I just realized now that while a bunch of Transformers get coated in this gold metal, only Bumblebee keeps the coating and gets a name change. Like, everybody else went, okay, now that the hate plague is over, scrape this stuff off me at once. And Bumblebee / Goldbug is like, nah, I'm finally slightly flashy, but still a bug. I'm keeping it. It's a weird episode, but let's be honest, the whole series is pretty weird. Especially as it got to season 3 where this episode sits, and 4, which was only 3 episodes long and marked the end of the animated Generation 1 series. Transformers the movie also had a soundtrack release, which was mostly mid-80s power metal and a re-release of the Weird Al song Dare to Be Stupid. So I was revisiting all of this stuff for this video, and it reminded me of a couple of personal memories. There's a bit of something that happened in 1977 that's since become family lore for us. And bear with me because it does relate back to Transformers eventually. So 1977, May, opening weekend of Star Wars. My brother was a young teen, maybe a preteen. I'm not calculating exactly what his age was, but he was around 10 or 11, I think. He really wanted to see Star Wars. Like, the commercials had been out for that. It looked absolutely awesome, and he wanted to go and see it. So my dad took him and one of our cousins who was about the same age. I was only 1.5 years old at the time, so I was not involved in this particular situation. But again, it's become like a family story. Anyway, our cousin got sick early into the movie, so they had to leave to take him home. And my brother was deeply disappointed because he'd been waiting so long for this awesome movie. But I'll tell you what, my dad turned around and took my brother back to the theater, bought 2 more tickets, and they got to finish watching Star Wars that day. Since that time, we saw every Star Wars movie with my dad in a theater, except for Solo, which I never saw in a theater, and The Last Jedi, which I saw alone because everybody else was not in town at the time. We'd all kind of moved into different cities. The first time my dad met the woman who is now my wife was at an opening weekend showing of Revenge of the Sith in 2005. My dad passed away last year right before Christmas, and I miss him so much, but I'm always going to have these memories, these stories of the times that he went the extra mile for his kids. Like, just buying a couple extra tickets to a movie seems like such a small thing, but when you're a kid, it's not small. It's huge. So my dad took me to see Transformers the movie opening weekend because he loved spending time with his kids. He took me to so many movies as a child, and it gives me a weirdly bittersweet smile to remember that when I was 10, my dad, who was the most gentle, calm soul you've ever met, took me to see this super violent movie about giant robots with a heavy metal soundtrack that he had no context for what was going on, no idea who the characters were, no understanding of the plot, and had a cartoon character saying the word shit. And to be very clear, my dad did not curse. I think I heard him say damn once in over 40 years of life. I remember mentioning how much I liked the music when we left the theater, and the expression on my dad's face, I think he was a little concerned. Because my dad was not a metal guy, not a punk guy, not a hard rock guy. My dad's musical taste basically ended in 1962 when Buddy Holly died. He liked 50s doo-wop stuff, Elvis, Nat King Cole, and some religious music from church, and that's it. He thought the British invasion ruined rock and roll in the 60s. So me being like, I think I'm into power metal now, Dad, had to have been disconcerting to him. But regardless of all this, he was there, and he took me to a ton of other things he didn't like, I'm sure. But he was there, and that meant something. So thanks, Dad. I also want to apologize to my mom for my weird, ill-advised obsession in 1984 with breakdancing movies. And I'm veering way off, but That led her to taking me to see Beat Street in a theater. If you don't know what Beat Street is, it's a movie whose climax is a scene where two graffiti artists fight each other and get electrocuted on the third rail of the New York subway system. She also took me to see both Breakin' and Breakin' 2 Electric Boogaloo, yeah, that year, because we had two Breakin' movies that came out in the same calendar year, because 1984 was a very weird time. So I've gone way off track. It's fine. A few thoughts on this movie at random. It was definitely a bomb on release, but it had enough of a following that it keeps getting new DVD and Blu-ray releases, including one in the next couple of months from Shout Factory, where they've restored the entire thing to 4K. The initial VHS release cut out the line where Spike says shit. I guess they thought they were going too far by using a word that we already all know and used, but okay. Nearly all the releases after that have restored the line. Side note, I couldn't get the soundtrack album in '86, but I did for a long time have a cassette tape recording I'd done off of the VHS tape of all the songs. So I had a version of the soundtrack that had all the movie dialogue in it, which was not ideal. It wasn't great quality, but when you're poor, you find ways to make do. I emerged from childhood to teen to adulthood and have become a lot more of a punk rock guy, but I still remember every song on this soundtrack. They're just ingrained in my brain. They have no real deep meaning, but they're just fun in a brainless sort of way, like most power metal. It takes me back to being 10 years old without all the bad memories of actually being 10 years old, and I have a lot of those, so that's pretty priceless. So the box office failures of Transformers the movie and the My Little Pony movie, which both came out that year, did kill an already in production theatrical G.I. Joe movie, which was then released straight to home video instead the following year. And they re-edited it because of the backlash to killing off Optimus Prime, because everyone was angry. Because initially in the G.I. Joe movie, they'd planned to kill off one of the main characters, Duke, who was basically like the leader. So instead, they did a kind of sloppy voice edit where he was just in a coma for a bit and got better. It was like, no, he's resting. He's pining for the fjords. So Hasbro apparently can learn from mistakes, I guess, but it takes them a while. The weird thing is, I don't think I would have been as bothered by them killing off Duke as I was about Optimus Prime. Now, if they'd tried to kill off Snake Eyes or Storm Shadow or something, my 11-year-old ass would have been trying to find the main Hasbro offices and burn them to the ground and salt the earth. The G.I. Joe movie is somehow much weirder than the Transformers movie. Maybe I'll do a video about that one, because boy oh boy is that a mind bender. As you can kind of tell from my longer than I intended it to be synopsis, this movie doesn't really make a lot of logical sense, and nothing in the animated canon really tries to justify any of it. These are sentient alien robots, which in itself is a weird concept, but this movie adds in the Matrix as a device powerful enough to instantly destroy a giant robot and give another robot an instant physical upgrade from thin air. And Unicron is able to similarly upgrade robots from thin air. And actually it's not even air because they're in outer space, but whatever. Basically it's all magic that doesn't really obey the laws of physics anyway. But then changing mass so that a giant robot that's at least a few stories tall so that it can turn into an object that can fit in a human's hand is pretty standard for the series. So I don't think that real world physics really matter. We're not meant to think about any of this too much. But I have ADHD and I'm a giant nerd, so I overthink everything. So here's more overthinking. They're robots in disguise, and they need to be so they can hide on Earth. That's the whole conceit of the series. But first, they're pretty constantly revealing themselves to humanity throughout the series. So there's not much reason for them to be in disguise anymore once their giant alien robots from space is out of the bag anyway. Also, they all had alternate forms on Cybertron as well, but they weren't in disguise there. They were just an alternate way to get around, like just turning into a vehicle to be able to move around quicker. Or in the case of Shockwave, so he could shoot people in gun mode, but he had a cannon on his arm in robot mode that he could shoot with, so why would he need to transform into a gun that someone else has to operate? It's kind of nonsensical. Overthinking. But this was a series made solely to sell toys to 8-year-olds, so it doesn't really matter, and I know that. The franchise has been rebooted several times over the years in other comics, animated series, toy lines, video games. Currently, most notably, the live-action films. I'm not a big fan of the Michael Bay films, or of Michael Bay films in general, to be honest. They're definitely loud and actiony, which is right, but it's fairly clear they don't want to do anything faithful to the source. And Bay admittedly is not a fan of the source, which he's said repeatedly, almost with pride, which is perplexing. Michael Bay is good at directing action sequences, but terrible at directing actors and getting anything approaching a performance. If there's a good performance in a Michael Bay film, it's a coincidence. The robot designs are honestly mostly terrible, and aside from Optimus Prime and Bumblebee, indistinguishable from each other. They mostly look like a pile of scrap metal or silverware that's been glued together, and when they fight, those piles are just kind of thrown at each other. It's very kind of just bland and unsatisfying. There's a scene near the end of the first movie where one of the robots gets literally ripped in half, and I wasn't sure which character it was, or if it was a good or bad guy, because they all look the same in that scene. I've been informed afterwards that it was Jazz, and the crime of the fact that I couldn't tell they were ripping Jazz in half. The robots in the Bay movies don't really have any personality, either in character or in visual style. The thing that makes the cartoon work is the melding of each robot's alt form, their very distinct robot forms, and a characterization that flows into that and makes them a real character that you care about when you see them on a big screen getting holes blown in them. And I don't want to harp on this too much. It's too late, whatever. Bumblebee being a Camaro instead of a VW Bug. Look, I know choices in these movies were made based on tie-in deals with car manufacturers, but that's an awful choice. Again, the characterizations of these various robots when the series started were very dependent on their alt forms. These were very specific choices, much like how Optimus is always coded as a strong, wise father figure that fits into this tough semi-motif. Because he's the leader, he's dad, you know? Bumblebee is supposed to be kind of childlike, less cool than the others who get to be race cars or Lamborghinis or Jeeps. He's essentially a POV character for the audience of kids. That's why he's a VW Bug. He's smaller, he's a little naive, he's barely taller than the human characters when he's in robot form. Having him be a muscle car in the live action movie because it's cool and fast and flashy entirely misses the point of what the character is supposed to be. They kept the color scheme of yellow and black, but otherwise, it's just a glaring symbol of how the makers of the movie just don't get it. And the name itself no longer makes sense. Bumblebee, he's a bug. It's a very specific pun that doesn't work with a Camaro. Then they also made him unable to speak because... Anyway, Michael Bay sucks. The 1986 animated movie is very weird. It shouldn't work. The plot is total nonsense at times, and it only existed to sell toys. And yet somehow it's got this weirdly enduring appeal. Every kid my age who grew up with these remembers the death of Optimus Prime and how that affected them. The voice cast is pretty amazing, and especially with the remasters that have been done over the years, the animation is still pretty cool for the time that it was made. There's a recurring catchphrase in the movie, "Till all are one." They even worked it into the metal remixed theme song lyrics at the opening and closing of the movie. But like, what does that mean, till all are one? Like, is this a reference to the various combiner transformers that can all link together to form one larger robot? Is the ultimate secret goal of Cybertronians to somehow combine every one of them into some massive giant robot that would tower over Unicron? I'm thinking not, because that would be a little weird. But then as I'm thinking about it more, I'm thinking, no, wait, this is all subliminal. This is a secret mission statement from Hasbro. They bought Tonka, they bought Kenner, they eventually buy every other toy maker that exists. They hide their plans right out here in the open, and they've been doing it since 1986. They are unstoppable, conquerors in disguise. More than meets the eye indeed, till all are one. But I'm on to you now, Hasbro, and I will spread the word. You can't stop me. Video over. Like, subscribe, notification bell, comments, audience engagement complete. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this. Thanks for coming to my meltdown.